Richard Caldwell stood at the entrance of Chateau Lumiere, his sharp eyes scanning the stream of people passing through the glass doors. He was the restaurant's owner, a 60-year-old man with an air of arrogance, always proud of keeping this Los Angeles establishment reserved for the right kind of elite. To Richard, this was his domain, and he had the power to decide who was allowed to enter. The glass doors swung open, and Elijah Washington appeared, a 70-year-old black man with silver hair, dressed in an old but finely tailored gray suit, carrying the calm demeanor of someone seasoned by life. Elijah stepped inside alone, his hands clasped in front of him, his eyes quietly searching for a seat. He said nothing, only nodding slightly to a nearby staff member as a greeting. Before diving into the story, comment where you're watching from and don't forget to subscribe, so you won't miss the latest stories. Richard spotted Elijah immediately, his brows furrowed, his mouth curling into a sneer. To him, Elijah didn't belong here. His dark skin and age were things Richard wouldn't accept in the classy image of Chateau Lumiere. He strode forward, his polished black shoes clicking on the floor, his voice ringing out cold and unwavering. "You there?" Richard called, his tone both polite and insulting. "I'm afraid we don't have a table for you tonight." Elijah paused, lifting his head to meet Richard's gaze. His eyes were calm, unsurprised, as if he was used to such rejections. "I see empty tables over there," he replied, his voice low and clear, pointing to two small tables in the corner, their white tablecloths, pristine and unwrinkled. Richard gave a thin smile, a harsh sound escaping his throat. He stepped closer, leaning down, so his voice was just loud enough for Elijah to hear. "Don't you get it? This is Chateau Lumiere, not a place for people like you. I don't care what you see. I'm the owner, and I say there's no room." He turned to David, a young staff member near the hostess stand, and ordered curtly, "Escort him out." David hesitated, his eyes darting from Richard to Elijah, clearly uneasy with the command, but he stepped forward, bowing his head and muttering an apology. "Please follow me, sir," he said, gesturing toward the door, his voice trembling. The atmosphere around them grew heavy, though laughter from other tables still echoed. A few nearby patrons turned to look, whispering among themselves, but no one intervened. Elijah stood still for a moment, his gaze locked on Richard. He adjusted his suit jacket, unhurried, then nodded slowly. "I understand," he said, his voice even but carrying a strange weight. He walked toward the door, but paused before leaving, turning back to face Richard. "You'll soon know who I am, but by then it'll be too late," he said, his warning brief but chilling. Richard shrugged, his sneer still fixed on his face. "Get out," he replied, his voice icy, unbothered by Elijah's words. To him, this was nothing worth noting. He'd turned away plenty of people like this before, those he deemed unworthy of Chateau Lumiere, and had never faced consequences. In his eyes, Elijah was just a lost old black man, not classy enough for his world. He turned away, signaling David to return to his post, then approached a table of guests, resuming business as if nothing had happened. But as the glass doors closed behind Elijah, a few eyes in the crowd lingered on Richard. A woman at a table near the entrance whispered to her friend, her voice a mix of shock and indignation, "Did he just kick that man out because he's black?" Her friend shook her head, not responding, but their eyes flashed with unease. Richard didn't hear, or chose to ignore it. He stood tall, smoothing his suit jacket, his smug smile intact. He believed no one could touch him, that Chateau Lumiere was his untouchable domain. Outside, Elijah stood under a streetlight, his hands in his suit pockets. He wasn't angry or sad, just tilted his head slightly, peering through the glass at the glowing interior. Chateau Lumiere, with all the arrogance Richard had built, had now become his target. He smiled, a subtle but meaningful smile, then walked into the darkness. His warning hung in the air, a promise Richard didn't yet know would soon come true. He didn't need to argue or say more. Richard's actions had dug a hole, and Elijah knew exactly how to make him fall into it. Richard Caldwell stood in the heart of Chateau Lumiere, his eyes sweeping over the dining tables with undisguised satisfaction. After ejecting Elijah Washington from the restaurant, he felt he'd reaffirmed his authority. To him, it wasn't an incident, but a small victory, a testament to maintaining the class he'd painstakingly cultivated for Chateau Lumiere. He walked to the hostess stand, his polished black shoes clicking on the floor, his sneer lingering from when Elijah left. "Amelia," Richard called, his tone both commanding and smug. Amelia Foster, the restaurant's manager, a young woman with sharp eyes, looked up from the reservation list. "Make sure no one like him slips in here tonight. We don't need people like that ruining the vibe of Chateau Lumiere." He emphasized "like that" with a smirk, as if the phrase alone clarified his meaning. Amelia nodded, but her hands tightened around her pen. "Yes, Mr. Caldwell," she replied evenly, hiding the unease rising within her. She'd witnessed the entire scene with Elijah, and though she didn't dare speak up, she felt an unshakable discomfort. But Richard didn't notice. He turned away, heading to a VIP table to inspect an expensive bottle of wine just brought out, as if erasing Elijah from his mind. To Richard, his actions were obvious. He recalled the times he'd turned away guests before, people of color, those not dressed elegantly enough, or simply ones he didn't like, and had never paid a price. He saw it as protecting Chateau Lumiere, keeping it free of the unworthy. He looked around, his gaze settling on the elite patrons laughing, their suits and evening gowns gleaming under the chandeliers. This is their place, he thought, his smug smile widening. He believed none of them would challenge him, that they silently agreed with how he ran things. Richard signaled a staff member to bring more wine, then walked to the large window overlooking Los Angeles' streets. He crossed his arms, watching the crowd outside, feeling above it all. Elijah, to him, was just a speck of dust he'd brushed off without mercy. He didn't know his name, didn't care who he was, and certainly didn't think Elijah's warning, "You'll soon know who I am, but by then, it'll be too late," held any weight. "Regret," Richard muttered, scoffing. "Never." Meanwhile, a few blocks from Chateau Lumiere, Elijah Washington sat in his small apartment in a quiet neighborhood. The modest space, with white walls and worn furniture, bore no resemblance to the home of someone who once held great power. Elijah removed his suit jacket, draped it over a chair, and sat at a scuffed wooden dining table. He opened a bottle of water, poured it into a glass, and took a small sip, his eyes calm but sharp. He wasn't angry about what had happened. To Elijah, Richard's insult was nothing new. He'd faced similar sneers and rejections since his youth, when he began building Washington Ventures, an investment fund once iconic in the business world. But now, after selling the company and choosing a low-profile life, he no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. Still, Richard's actions weren't something he could ignore, not out of pride, but because he saw a chance to change things, not just for himself, but for others treated as he was. Elijah pulled his phone from his pocket and dialed a familiar number. On the other end, the young, energetic voice of Lucas Bennett, an entrepreneur Elijah had mentored since his college days, answered. "Lucas," Elijah said, his voice low but firm, "I need your help with something." "Hey, Mr. Washington," Lucas replied, upbeat. "What's up? You don't usually call this late." Elijah gave a faint smile, his eyes drifting to the window where city lights flickered. "You know Chateau Lumiere?" he asked. "That fancy restaurant downtown?" "Sure," Lucas said. "Why bring it up?" "The owner just made a big mistake," Elijah said, his voice even but layered with meaning. "I want you to dig into it. Finances, lease agreements, everything. I think it has potential, but it needs the right management." He paused, then added, "I'll back you if needed." Lucas hesitated, sensing the weight in Elijah's tone. "You want to buy it?" he asked, curious. "Not exactly," Elijah replied. "I want it to change. Just get started, and I'll fill you in later." Lucas chuckled softly. "All right, Mr. Washington, I'm on it. But what's your angle here? Witcher dam demide?" Elijah didn't answer directly. He just nodded, though Lucas couldn't see. "Just do it," he said, then hung up. He set the phone down, his eyes turning icy. He didn't need to act himself. Lucas would handle the groundwork, but Elijah would pull the strings. Richard never saw coming. In his quiet apartment, Elijah sat with his glass of water, his mind already mapping the next steps. He wasn't in a rush, never had been. Richard could stay smug for now, but Elijah knew his time was running out. Days after ejecting Elijah Washington, Richard still wore his smugness, but a faint unease began creeping in. He couldn't shake Elijah's piercing gaze, or his warning, "You'll soon know who I am, but by then, it'll be too late," though he tried to dismiss it as nonsense. To Richard, Chateau Lumiere remained his untouchable domain, and he was determined to keep it that way. He approached the hostess stand, where Amelia Foster was reviewing the reservation list. "Amelia," Richard called, his tone harsher than usual. "Tonight, I want you to screen every guest before they enter. No more people like that old man slipping through. Got it?" He emphasized, "like that old man," with a smirk, his eyes dripping with disdain. Amelia looked up, her hands pausing on the paper. "Yes, Mr. Caldwell," she replied evenly, but inside, the unease from that night hadn't faded. She'd seen how Richard treated Elijah, not just refusing him, but publicly humiliating him, and it gnawed at her, but she didn't dare object, only nodded and resumed work, her hands gripping the pen tightly to suppress her feelings. Richard didn't notice Amelia's hesitation. He turned away, striding past silk-draped tables, inspecting every detail, the fold of napkins, the chandelier's glow, even the angle of wine glasses. To him, everything had to be perfect, reflecting the class he'd defined for Chateau Lumiere. He believed that as long as he held control, no one, Elijah or anyone else, could touch him. But his confidence wavered when David, the young staff member, approached with a worried look. "Mr. Caldwell," David said, his voice low but urgent, "there's a social media post going viral. A guest from that night, Grace Harper, wrote about you kicking out the old black man. She called it racism." Richard's brows knitted, his eyes darkening. "Grace Harper," he muttered, trying to place her. "Show me." David handed over his phone, displaying Grace's post. "Last night at Chateau Lumiere, I saw the owner kick out an elderly black man just for his skin color. Is this how they treat guests? Shameful." The post had hundreds of shares, with comments piling up, slamming Richard. Richard scoffed, handing the phone back. "Just some nonsense online," he said, his voice cold. "No one cares. Our regulars don't read this stuff." He told David to forget it, and returned to overseeing the restaurant, but a seed of doubt sprouted inside him. He approached a VIP table, casually asking a few loyal guests if they'd heard anything, but they just smiled and shook their heads, easing his mind for the moment. Yet, as the evening wore on, Richard noticed several usually packed tables sitting empty. A regular called to cancel, citing a vague busy schedule, but their hesitant tone made him suspicious. He ordered Amelia to call back and confirm, but she only got evasive answers. "They wouldn't say why," Amelia reported, avoiding his gaze. He waved it off, telling himself it was a coincidence, but the unease grew stronger. Meanwhile, in his small apartment, Elijah Washington sat at his dining table, his eyes calm but sharp. He picked up his phone and called Lucas Bennett, who was at his office a few blocks away. "Lucas," Elijah said, his voice low and steady, "what have you found on Chateau Lumiere?" Lucas chuckled, over the line. "I've started, Mr. Washington. The restaurant's got a big loan, and their lease is up soon. If we apply pressure at the right time, they'll have no choice but to sell." His voice brimmed with confidence, as if victory was already in sight. "Good," Elijah replied, his fingers tapping lightly on the table. "Do you know who owns the building?" Lucas paused briefly. "A major real estate firm in LA. I'm digging deeper." Elijah nodded, though Lucas couldn't see. "Keep at it," he said. "I want everything ready soon." He didn't elaborate, but in his mind, the plan was clear. He didn't need to act himself. Lucas would execute, but Elijah would pull the strings, step by step. Lucas asked curiously, "You still haven't told me what you're aiming for. Just buying the place?" Elijah smiled faintly, a subtle grin. "Not just that," he said. I want Richard Caldwell to learn he can't keep doing this. Get to work, and you'll see." The call ended, and Elijah gazed out the window as the sunset bled across the sky. He wasn't in a hurry, never had been, but he knew better than anyone that the waters were starting to ripple. On the other end, Richard might keep his voice steady, but Elijah could hear the tension beneath, a familiar sign when pressure begins to crack pride. At Caldwell's restaurant, Richard stood behind the hostess stand, his hands gripping the back of a chair, as if clinging to a fragile anchor. Since Grace Harper's post went viral, things had started to fracture. The once glamorous, lively atmosphere was now tinged with an uneasy quiet. Empty tables multiplied, and Richard, though maintaining a calm facade and professional greetings, couldn't ignore the storm quietly encircling him. Elijah had foreseen it, and now Richard was starting to feel it. He turned to Amelia Foster, his eyes icy. "Amelia," he ordered, his tone sharper than ever, "call every guest who canceled tonight. I want their real reasons." He stressed real, with a smirk, as if doubting every excuse he'd heard. Amelia hesitated, her hands trembling slightly as she held the phone. "I've called Mr. Caldwell," she replied, her voice soft but steady. "They just said they're busy, or can't make it." No one said more. She lowered her head, avoiding his gaze, but inside, her unease had grown into something stronger, a silent anger. Richard waved her off, turning to pace past the empty tables faster than usual. He checked every detail: napkins, glasses, floral arrangements, as if surface perfection could hide the spreading cracks. But he couldn't ignore the truth. Chateau Lumiere's revenue was dropping, and Grace Harper's name now appeared across social media, paired with harsh criticism. A local paper had jumped in, publishing an article titled, "Luxury LA Restaurant Owner Accused of Racism." It quoted Grace, and a former employee, who detailed Richard's history of rejecting guests based on looks or skin color. Richard grabbed the paper from a table, his hands shaking as he read each line. "Nonsense," he muttered, tossing it to the floor. He called David, the young staffer who'd escorted Elijah out, and barked, "Find a way to contact this Grace woman. I want her to retract that post." But David just shook his head, his voice shaky. "She's not responding, sir, and the post has thousands of shares now." The real pressure hit when Richard's phone rang. It was Henry Sullivan, Chateau Lumiere's biggest investor. "Richard," Henry's voice came through, cold and cutting. "What's your explanation for this? I just met with our partners, and they're not happy. Revenue's down, public opinion's against us. What's your plan?" Richard gripped the phone, forcing a calm tone. "Henry, it's just a small misunderstanding. I've hired a PR firm to handle it. It'll blow over soon." But Henry cut him off, his voice unrelenting. "Small. You kicked out a guest because of his skin color, and now the whole city knows. The restaurant's got a big loan, Richard. If you don't fix this, we're pulling our funding." The call ended, leaving Richard frozen, his breathing heavy. He looked around the restaurant, now with only a few scattered guests. He told Amelia to prepare a statement calling it all a misunderstanding. But before she could, another blow landed. Amelia approached, phone in hand, her eyes more resolute than ever. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, her voice trembling but firm, "I just sent the paper some information about the other times you turned guests away. I can't work here anymore." She placed her employee badge on the counter and walked out. Richard stood stunned, his eyes blazing with rage. "You dare betray me," he roared. But Amelia didn't stop. She passed through the glass doors, leaving Richard alone in the empty space. Her defiance was the final knife, shattering the smug shell he'd clung to. He lunged for his phone, calling the PR firm, demanding they squash everything. But the voice on the other end only offered helplessness. "We're trying, but it's gone too far." Meanwhile, at his small apartment, Elijah Washington sat at his dining table, his eyes calm but piercing. He picked up his phone and called Lucas Bennett. "Lucas," he said, his voice low and steady, "have you got enough information?" Lucas chuckled over the line. More than enough, Mr. Washington. Chateau Lumiere's on the brink. Their loan's due soon, and their lease is shaky. I've contacted the real estate firm that owns the building. They're open to working with us. If we make a good offer. His voice radiated confidence, as if everything was already secured. Elijah nodded, his fingers tapping lightly on the table. Good work, he said. Prepare a buyout offer. Make it higher than market value, but with a condition. Richard Caldwell leaves the industry for good. He paused, his eyes flashing. Get it to him as soon as possible. Lucas hesitated. You sure? What if he refuses? He won't, Elijah said, his voice steady. More a statement than a guess. He didn't need to explain. In his mind, every move was planned. Actions, reactions, and the final outcome. Elijah had endured enough rejections in LA during his rise, enough sneers when he entered rooms where no one thought he belonged. From that, he built Washington Ventures. This time he wasn't just doing business. He was righting a wrong, with experience, patience, and if needed, pressure. Lucas, sitting across from him, gave a thin smile. All right, Mr. Washington. The letter will reach him in 2 days. 2 days later, as Elijah predicted, Richard Caldwell received the letter, a buyout offer for Chateau Lumiere, at a price well above market value. The name Lucas Bennett was unfamiliar, but the sharp wording and confident tone suggested this wasn't a casual offer. Amid pressure from Amelia Foster, Henry Sullivan, and the lingering fallout from Grace Harper's post, Richard felt the ground slipping beneath him. He entered the building where the meeting was set, trying to maintain his usual composure. His hand adjusted his suit collar as he passed through glass doors, his eyes scanning the luxurious interior, ebony tables, polished stone floors, large windows framing the city's shifting skyline. But behind his confidence burned a quiet unease. He knew time was no longer on his side. Lucas Bennett, a young man with a confident smile, rose from a leather chair, extending a hand. Mr. Caldwell, Lucas said smoothly, thanks for coming. Richard nodded, shaking hands briefly, then sat, his eyes wary. He'd expected a wealthy investor, someone of his class. But Lucas, barely in his 30s, dressed elegantly but not ostentatiously, made Richard frown. Still, he kept his tone firm. Your letter, he said coldly. Cut to it. What do you want with Chateau Lumiere? Lucas smiled, not answering immediately. He gestured toward the door, and someone entered. Elijah Washington. Richard froze, his eyes widening as he recognized the 70-year-old black man he'd ejected from his restaurant. Elijah, in his old gray suit, walked slowly but steadily, his icy gaze locked on Richard. He sat beside Lucas, saying nothing, just watching, but his presence made the room feel heavy as lead. You? Richard blurted, his voice trembling with shock and anger. What are you doing here? What kind of joke is this? He turned to Lucas, his eyes blazing. You dragged me here to meet this old man again? Lucas kept his smile, but his voice sharpened. No joke, Mr. Caldwell. Mr. Elijah Washington is behind the offer to buy Chateau Lumiere. I'm just acting on his behalf. Richard let out a dry, forced laugh. Him? An old man who couldn't afford a meal at my restaurant. Don't waste my time. He stood to leave, but Elijah's low, steady voice stopped him cold. Sit down, Mr. Caldwell, Elijah said, not raising his voice but carrying an undeniable weight. Richard turned back, his eyes flickering between anger and confusion, then sat reluctantly. Elijah continued, his voice even but chilling. You misjudged me from the start. I'm Elijah Washington, founder of Washington Ventures, a fund that once owned major businesses, including the real estate firm holding your restaurant's lease. Richard went still, his hands trembling on the table. He tried to speak, but Elijah didn't give him a chance. I'm not here to brag, he said, his gaze piercing through Richard's crumbling arrogance. I'm here to change Chateau Lumiere, make it a place where no one's turned away for their skin color or age, and you won't be part of it. Lucas slid a folder across the table toward Richard. This is the formal offer, he said, his voice smooth but firm. We'll buy Chateau Lumiere above market value, enough to clear your loan and leave you with plenty. But there's a condition. You leave the restaurant industry for good, and don't publicly oppose this deal. Refuse, and we'll expose everything, from your history of discrimination to the restaurant's shaky finances. Your choice." Richard stared at the folder, his breathing heavy. He flipped through a few pages, but the words blurred before his eyes. "This is blackmail," he growled, his voice shaking. "I won't sell. Chateau Lumiere is mine." Elijah tilted his head, his eyes unwavering. "Not blackmail," he said. "Consequences. Did you think you could treat people like that without paying a price? You were wrong, Mr. Caldwell. And now, you're out of options." Richard slammed his hand on the table, standing abruptly. "Who do you think you are to lecture me?" he shouted, but his voice cracked, lacking strength. He turned to Lucas, his eyes pleading. "You can't do this. I'll find another way. I have investors." Lucas shook his head, his smile gone. "Henry Sullivan and your partners know about this offer. They want you to sell. They're done with the scandal. Refuse, and they'll pull funding. Chateau Lumiere will collapse within a month." Richard sank back into his chair, his hands trembling as he covered his face. He looked at Elijah, his eyes now a mix of anger and fear. "Why?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Why do this just because I kicked you out?" Elijah stood, adjusting his suit collar, his gaze still icy. "Not because of me," he said. "For everyone you've turned away, you wouldn't understand. Not now." He turned and walked out, leaving Lucas with Richard. Richard tried to speak, but his words caught in his throat. He looked at Lucas, his eyes desperate. "Give me time to think," he whispered. Lucas nodded, but his voice held no leniency. "You have 24 hours. After that, everything goes public." He stood and left, leaving Richard alone in the silent room. Richard Caldwell sat in his lavish Beverly Hills apartment, his trembling hands clutching the folder. Lucas Bennett had left. The 24 hours since his meeting with Lucas and Elijah Washington had passed like a nightmare. He stared at the contract to sell Chateau Lumiere, each word stabbing at his pride. The offer was above market value, enough to clear his loan and leave him with plenty, but the conditions, leaving the restaurant industry forever, and staying silent, felt like having everything stripped away. He'd called Henry Sullivan again, begging for support, but Henry had only said coldly, "Sell, Richard. We can't save you anymore." With no way out, he knew he had to agree. Richard picked up a pen, his hand shaking as he signed the contract. He emailed it to Lucas with a short message. "It's done." Just 2 words, but they carried the weight of 1,000 pounds, marking the end of the empire he'd prided himself on building. He sank into his leather chair, his eyes empty as he stared out the window. Los Angeles sprawled before him, but he was no longer part of it. He'd lost Chateau Lumiere, not just the restaurant, but the symbol of power and prestige he'd once held. News of the buyout spread quickly. A local paper ran a story headlined, "Chateau Lumiere sold after racism scandal." The article didn't just cover the sale, but dug into Richard's ejection of Elijah Washington, quoting Grace Harper and evidence from Amelia Foster. Social media erupted with comments branding Richard, the racist who got exposed. Some loyal patrons who'd once praised him now publicly turned away, posting their disappointment. "I used to love Chateau Lumiere, but now I'm ashamed to have supported him." Richard tried to salvage his reputation with an interview at a small outlet. He sat before the camera, trying to stay composed, but his voice faltered as he said, "It was all a misunderstanding. I didn't discriminate. I just wanted to keep the restaurant classy." But his defense only fanned the flames. Online comments shot back. "Classy by kicking out a man for his skin color? He still won't admit he's wrong." The interview became the final blow, pushing him into complete isolation. He called old friends from the elite circle, those who'd clinked glasses with him at Chateau Lumiere, but no one answered. Henry Sullivan, his biggest financial backer, cut contact. Richard stood in his vast apartment, surrounded by expensive paintings and luxury furniture, but felt hollow. He walked to the bar, poured a glass of whiskey, but even its bitter burn couldn't dull the defeat eating at him. He thought back to the early days of opening Chateau Lumiere, the dazzling lights, the praise, the respect from the crowd. He'd been a king in his world, but now he was just a forgotten man. He wondered if his arrogance had been worth it, if ejecting Elijah, if turning away countless others, had truly protected the class he'd prided himself on. But he had no answers, only a quiet regret rising, though he tried to bury it under his anger. Meanwhile, in a small office, a few blocks away, Lucas Bennett sat with his team, preparing for Chateau Lumiere's transition. Elijah Washington wasn't there, but he'd called Lucas right after receiving Richard's signed contract. "Good work, Lucas," Elijah said over the phone, his voice low and steady. "Now start changing it." Lucas smiled faintly. "We're ready, Mr. Washington. I've asked Amelia to come back as manager." She agreed immediately. "We'll make Chateau Lumiere something different, just like you wanted." He paused, then asked, "Want to come see it?" Elijah shook his head, though Lucas couldn't see. "No need," he replied. "I trust you. Get to it." He hung up, sitting back in his modest apartment, his eyes calm as he looked out the window. He didn't need to see the change himself. He knew it was happening, and that was enough. Back at Chateau Lumiere, Lucas and Amelia got to work. They cleared out Richard's last traces, the pompous paintings he'd hung, the strict rules he'd enforced. Amelia stood in the restaurant, her eyes bright as she envisioned a place where everyone was welcome. Lucas clapped her shoulder, grinning. "We'll do better than he ever did." Amelia nodded, her heart full of resolve. Richard, in his apartment, turned class =caliber 7, turned on the TV, and a brief news segment appeared. Chateau Lumiere set to reopen under new management, promising an inclusive space for all. He shut it off instantly, unable to hear more. He stood, walked to the window, and looked down at the city, now foreign to him. He'd lost everything, the restaurant, his reputation, his friends, all for an arrogant decision he'd once thought was right. Chateau Lumiere reopened under dazzling lights, but it was no longer Richard Caldwell's restaurant. Lucas Bennett and Amelia Foster had turned it into a new space, still elegant, but warm and welcoming, like never before. The walls, once lined with haughty art, now held vibrant photos, reflecting LA's diversity. The menu wasn't just pricey French dishes anymore, but blended flavors from many cultures, spicy tacos to fragrant pho, drawing a new crowd, from young folks to working-class families. On opening night, a line stretched outside the glass doors, laughter replacing the stifling silence of Richard's final days. Amelia stood in the restaurant, her eyes glowing as she watched every table filled. She wore a simple but elegant dress, holding the guest list, but no longer checking who was worthy. Lucas approached, clapping her shoulder, grinning. "We did it, Amelia. This is the Chateau Lumiere people needed." Amelia nodded, her voice firm. "No one gets turned away here anymore," she said, her eyes sweeping the diverse crowd, white, black, young, old, all blending into the warm atmosphere. One evening, Elijah Washington visited. He slipped in quietly, still in his old gray suit, not wanting attention. Lucas and Amelia sat him at a small corner table where he could watch without being disturbed. Elijah looked around, his eyes calm but pleased. He saw a black family laughing at a table, a group of young friends snapping photos of new dishes, and even past guests Richard had rejected, now back with smiles. He sipped his water, thinking of the days he'd been treated as unworthy. Chateau Lumiere was now proof of what he'd always believed. An open door for all would outlast a closed one. Lucas sat beside Elijah, curious. "What do you think, Mr. Washington?" Elijah gave a faint, warm smile. "You did better than I expected," he replied. "This isn't just a restaurant, it's a message." He didn't say more, but in his heart, he thought of his late wife, who'd taught him the value of compassion. Chateau Lumiere was part of the promise he'd made her, to use his power for change. Meanwhile, in his lavish Beverly Hills apartment, Richard Caldwell sat alone before his TV. He turned it on, and images of the new Chateau Lumiere flashed up. The once controversial restaurant, now a beacon of inclusion, drawing hundreds nightly. The anchor interviewed Amelia, who smiled brightly. We want everyone to feel welcome, not judged. Richard shut off the TV, his hands clenching the chair. He couldn't stand seeing his restaurant, or rather, what used to be his, thrive under others. He stood, walked to the bar, but the whiskey bottle sat untouched, gathering a thin layer of dust. He called an old friend, an investor who'd toasted with him at Chateau Lumiere, but the phone rang unanswered. He tried Henry Sullivan, only getting voicemail. Richard dropped the phone, his eyes empty as he scanned his vast apartment. The pricey paintings, the luxury furniture, they were just lifeless decor now, unable to fill the loneliness engulfing him. On a sofa, his hands covered his face. Through a flashback, he recalled his father's words from youth. Class is something you hold at all costs, Richard. Don't let anyone drag you down. He'd lived by that, rejecting people like Elijah, building Chateau Lumiere into a fortress of arrogance. But now, he saw that creed had led to his ruin. He'd traded everything, his restaurant, his reputation, his friends, for a class now worthless. Richard looked out the window, the city lights twinkling distantly. He wondered if he could have done differently, if he could have let Elijah in instead of kicking him out. But the question had no answer, only deepening regret. He was no longer Chateau Lumiere's king, just a forgotten man, living with mistakes he couldn't undo. At Chateau Lumiere, opening night ended with roaring applause. Lucas and Amelia stood among the crowd, soaking in the joy from guests. A reporter asked, "What makes the new Chateau Lumiere different?" Amelia answered instantly, her voice steady. "We don't turn anyone away, that's the biggest difference." Elijah, from his corner table, heard her, nodding slightly. He stood, leaving as quietly as he'd come, content with what he'd helped create. Richard Caldwell stood before the glass doors, his hands deep in his coat pockets, his eyes wavering between longing and regret. Weeks had passed since the restaurant reopened under Lucas Bennett and Amelia Foster, and its fame now spread further than ever. He'd come one last time, hoping to reclaim a shred of the days he'd been its owner, the days he'd been king of his domain. He pulled out his phone, calling the familiar reservation number, his voice straining for calm. "I'd like a table tonight," he said. A young woman's voice, polite but firm, replied, "I'm sorry, sir, we're fully booked tonight." Richard frowned, his voice rising. "Check again. This is Richard Caldwell." But the line went quiet for a moment, then her voice returned, unwavering. "I'm sorry, but there's no room, sir." The call ended, leaving Richard stunned. The hostess didn't know he'd once owned the place. Or maybe they did and didn't care. He peered through the glass, seeing a diverse crowd streaming in, young, old, white, black, all chatting lively. Chateau Lumiere glowed with light, no longer his haughty fortress, but a place for everyone. Richard stood frozen, his eyes empty. He realized he'd been completely forgotten, pushed to the margins of the world he'd built. He turned, walking away, but the image of the radiant restaurant haunted him. He understood too late that his prejudice hadn't just hurt others, it had destroyed him. A few blocks away, Elijah Washington sat in his small apartment, his eyes calm, as he gazed out the window. He didn't visit Chateau Lumiere often. He didn't need to. He lived simply, still mentoring young entrepreneurs like Lucas, using his experience to open new doors. He didn't boast about his victory over Richard, didn't need to. For Elijah, Chateau Lumiere was proof of dignity and change, the promise he'd made to his late wife, long ago. The final image is Chateau Lumiere,
blazing in the night,
laughter echoing through its glass doors, while Richard stands alone under a streetlight, his figure shrinking into the dark. The story of Richard Caldwell and Elijah Washington mirrors real issues in the U.S. today, especially racial and age-based prejudice, and the consequences of arrogance in modern society. Richard, smugly rejecting Elijah for his skin color and age, represents discriminatory attitudes still present in public spaces and businesses, from upscale restaurants to major corporations. His words, "This is Chateau Lumiere, not a place for people like you," echo how some individuals or organizations in America still maintain class by excluding those who don't fit their desired image. In contrast, Elijah, an elderly black man who built Washington Ventures, symbolizes the hidden strength of those underestimated, who've overcome prejudice to achieve success, a reality often seen in America's history and current society. Richard's downfall, losing his restaurant, reputation, and community support, shows the power of public opinion and social media in today's U.S. Grace Harper's viral post spread quickly, much like how movements like Black Lives Matter or discrimination scandals blow up on Twitter and TikTok, forcing wrongdoers to face accountability. Chateau Lumiere's transformation under Lucas and Amelia, becoming an inclusive space with a diverse menu and guests from all walks, reflects a positive trend in America, where businesses increasingly see the value of diversity to survive and thrive. The lesson is this: in today's America, don't let prejudice cloud your judgment, as Richard did by misjudging Elijah. Open your heart to everyone, regardless of looks or background, because arrogance can lead to isolation, like when Richard was turned away from his own restaurant in Part 8. Instead, learn from Elijah, patient, humble, and using his strength to drive positive change, as he turned Chateau Lumiere into a symbol of inclusion. In a diverse nation like the U.S., respect and openness aren't just moral, they're the key to lasting success. Hit subscribe to explore more deep lessons like Richard's fall and the power of inclusion. Thank you, and we'll see you soon.